Good evening. Good evening. I'm Mark Updegrove, the director of the LBJ Presidential Library. I want to welcome you here tonight. And before I bring on Elizabeth Christian, who will introduce tonight's guest, I just want to tell you that I want to thank you all. In recent weeks, in particular, I've gotten a number of people who have come up to me and told me how much they enjoy being a member of the LBJ Friends Group. And I want to tell you how much that means to me. You have been very generous in your praise of this program and of this library. And you've also been very generous in suggestions that you've had about, very generous. I want to tell you how much it means for me to hear both those things. I love hearing how well we're doing, because I can tell you that we try to knock it out of the park every time we do a program here. So it means the world to me when you tell me that you're getting great value out of your membership. We're always going to strive to do the best that we can for you. And I also value your feedback, and I can tell you that it registers and it's helped to guide the Friends program. So please be forthcoming with your suggestions. They mean just as much to us. I would ask, if you enjoy this membership, that in return, that you help us to fill every seat in this auditorium. We are trying to get the biggest names and best minds through our door, and tonight is a great example. Richard Norton Smith is not only a dear friend of mine, he's also one of the great historians our country has today, and you'll see that by reading his book on Nelson Rockefeller, which he'll talk about tonight. But in exchange for that, in exchange for all the time and effort that we put into this program, we ask that you sell it to your friends, or family members, and you try to help us to fill every seat. That would be a great tribute to this library and to the folks that we bring here on stage. So thank you again for your generous support of this library and this membership group. And with that, I will hand it over to my friend, Elizabeth Christian, the president of the LBJ Foundation. Thank you very much.
Good evening. It is my honor to welcome you here. I am president of the LBJ Foundation. My name's Elizabeth Christian. And on behalf of Foundation Chairman Larry Temple and our entire board of directors, I want to echo what Mark just said. We are so grateful for this group, and we're so glad to see you all here. It's also a big honor tonight to introduce our guest, Richard Norton Smith. To call Richard Norton Smith an authority on American presidents is perhaps the understatement of the year. Mr. Smith is arguably the authority on the modern presidency. Between 1987 and 2001, he served as the director of the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library, the Dwight Eisenhower Center, the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library, and the Gerald Ford Museum and Library. He also served as director of the Robert J. Dole Institute of Politics at the University of Kansas and was the first executive director of the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum. I can't imagine that this is a record that will ever be broken, nor is it easy to figure out how Richard has had enough time to be as prolific as he's been as a writer. After serving on staff with Senator Robert Dole, Mr. Smith collaborated with Bob and Elizabeth Dole on their joint autobiography and also helped Mr. Dole write 2 subsequent books on political humor, and our president, Lyndon Johnson, was subject of some of that. Mr. Smith's first major book of his own, entitled Thomas E. Dewey and His Times, was a finalist for the 1983 Pulitzer Prize. Richard Norton Smith has also written An Uncommon Man, The Triumph of Herbert Hoover, The Harvard Century, The Making of a University to a Nation, Patriarch, George Washington and the New American Nation. And in June 1997, Mr. Smith's The Colonel, The Life and Legend of Robert R. McCormick was published, and that book has been described as the best book ever written about the press. Richard Norton Smith graduated magna cum laude from Harvard. His roommate, Steve Chapman, I think Steve's parents are here tonight, I hope they are, who is now on the editorial board of the Chicago Tribune, happens to be a lifelong close friend of mine too. When I learned that I would have the pleasure of introducing Richard Norton Smith, I thought, I'm not going to just Google him. I want to find out some real stuff. So I asked Steve for insights that we might not glean from a mere search of the internet. Could you have guessed that Richard Norton Smith is a hurricane aficionado and has taken a plane into the eye of a storm? He's a devotee of Charles de Gaulle. He's a veritable encyclopedia of Broadway musicals. He has visited every single presidential grave site, and he has a gorgeous singing voice. I hope Mark Updegrove, director of the LBJ Presidential Library and tonight's interviewer, will get more details on these enticing tidbits. Richard Norton Smith is here with us to share his thoughts on his latest book, On His Own Terms, A Life of Nelson Rockefeller, which is already being called the definitive work on a man who made it to vice president and never quite cracked the code to be president. Please help me welcome Richard Norton Smith and Mark Updegrove to the stage.
Well done. Thank you.
Thanks.
Welcome, Richard.
Comfortable chairs. The bane of author's existence, you know? You sit in these little... Anyway.
We brought out the best chairs for you, Richard.
Thank you.
We brought the best for you.
I'll try to bring out the best stories for you.
Good, good. Well, this is an epic book about an epic subject. And it was 14 years in the making. So first, let's talk about the epic subject, Nelson Rockefeller. Why did you choose to take on Nelson Rockefeller?
You know, every once in a while you hear about the book you were born to write, and it's a phrase I never thought I'd use, except now. 14 years actually underestimates my fascination with the man. I was a very oddly annoying, precocious child. Some would say it was a preview of coming attractions. But in any event, in 1964, the epic party redefining battle between Barry Goldwater, representing the Sun Belt conservative wing of the party, now long since dominant, and Nelson Rockefeller, a fading Eastern establishment that had been responsible for the likes of Wendell Willkie and Tom Dewey and Dwight Eisenhower, arguably Richard Nixon. One of the last political conventions that really mattered. And it was an amazing scene. It was in the Cow Palace outside San Francisco, and there were 3,000 Republican delegates who were behaving like Democrats, if you know what I mean. Democrats are supposed to have fights like this. Republicans are supposed to be scripted and well-behaved. But it was a fight over something profound. It was geographical, it was philosophical. It really was a reopening of the wound first opened in 1912 between Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft. A month before the convention, this fight had reached its climax in California, a California primary, where the weekend before the primary, Nelson Rockefeller Jr. was born, which reminded everyone that Governor Rockefeller, in addition to being a, quote, big spending Eastern liberal, had divorced his first wife, married a much younger woman, and now fathered a child. And there's plenty of evidence to suggest that it was just enough. The morality issue in 1964 arguably cut in ways that 50 years later, people might be scratching their heads about. But it was enough to put Goldwater just over the top. So there was no question coming into the Cow Palace who had won this fight numerically. But Rockefeller and those who agreed with him were not about to go down without a fight. The great issue was civil rights. Barry Goldwater, who, let's be fair, was no racist personally. Goldwater, for example, in Arizona, had led the fight to desegregate the National Guard and his own family's department stores. But Goldwater was that brand of libertarian who at least in 1964, believed that government had no right to tell people who they could and couldn't associate with or conduct business with.
He believed it was a constitutional matter.
He did. Nelson Rockefeller came from a very different tradition. Some of the things discovered in this book give you an idea of just how close he was, for example, to Dr. King. In 1958, some of you may remember, Dr. King was stabbed by a crazed assailant in Harlem. His hospital bills were picked up by Nelson Rockefeller.
Anonymously.
In 1963, the Birmingham Crusade, the height, the moral backbone of the civil rights movement. And they were running out of people to put in jail, and so they turned to children. And of course, it was the pictures of those kids and Bull Connors, police dogs, and water hoses that really shocked the conscience of the nation. But the idea was to send all these kids out in demonstrations. They would be arrested, their bail would be paid, they'd be out on the street, and the cycle would repeat itself. They were out of money. Mm-hmm. Nelson Rockefeller provided almost $100,000 anonymously to pay the bail bonds. And then tragically, in 1968, when Dr. King was killed, just a few days after President Johnson announced his own withdrawal from the race, and Nelson had announced that he would not run in 1968, Nelson Rockefeller sent his agents and his checkbook to Atlanta and paid for and organized Dr. King's funeral. But he insisted that it not be made public because he didn't want to take advantage of the family's suffering. And in fact, the story remained hidden until... Anyway, I ramble, but it gives you some idea of what mattered, what this man was passionate about, and why 1964 is such a turning point. So anyway, that night, the second night of the convention, Governor Rockefeller was scheduled. They gave him 5 minutes to talk about a platform plank that the moderates wanted to add. And it was very simple. It was denouncing political extremism. Now remember, this is the summer of 1964. President Johnson is sending extra FBI people to Mississippi, where civil rights workers are missing, have been murdered. Extremism in the summer of 1964 was no abstract term.
Right.
Rockefeller specifically defined it for the benefit of the national viewing audience. It was the Communist Party of America, the Ku Klux Klan, and here's the rub, the John Birch Society, at the mention of which the place exploded. I don't know how many Birchers there were, but there were plenty, particularly. But more than that, symbolically, Barry Goldwater, I think, would be the first to say, people like Bill Buckley said this, the biggest cross they had to bear were some of the nut jobs who ostensibly believed in the movement. This was all on national TV, and as the minutes crawled by, there was a woman who immortalized herself, who got up on a chair not far from the podium and screamed on camera, "You lousy lover, you lousy lover," which had very little to do with his political views and everything to do with the cultural earthquake
right.
that had taken place and was still unfolding in San Francisco. And again, America was a very different country. So Nelson Rockefeller was the personification of everything these people hated. He was the Eastern establishment. He had a sense of humor about it. Just before the California primary, the great political strategist Stu Spencer, who later became very well known as Ronald Reagan's
right.
chief advisor. Anyway, Spencer, the polls were not looking good. There were no volunteers. There was lots of money, but that was all. Spencer said, "Governor, it's time to call an Eastern establishment." And Rockefeller said, "You're looking at it, buddy. I'm all that's left." And in a sense, he was. But he made what many people thought was a heroic last stand at that convention. And I, at the ripe old age of 10, had persuaded my parents to let me to stay up that night. And I suppose that night planted the seeds all these years later of On His Own Terms.
We'll come back to that seminal convention in 1964, but talk about, if you would, Rockefeller's famous family. He is the grandson of John David Rockefeller, famous capitalist. What does his childhood look like?
It's fascinating. First of all, he never felt self-conscious, perhaps uniquely in the family, about being a Rockefeller. And that's one of the things that set him apart, not only from his brothers, but his father, because he was his mother's son. His mother was this remarkable woman, Abby Aldrich Rockefeller. And one of the first discoveries I made, to my own surprise, that Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller is more an Aldrich than he is a Rockefeller. Nelson Aldrich, the original, was Republican leader of the United States Senate from Rhode Island, corrupt in the Gilded Age style of corruption, but also a great collector of art. History would repeat itself. His daughter, Abby, was this marvelous kind of combination of Margaret Sanger and Auntie Mame. You know, this colorful, larger-than-life, open to all new experiences, endlessly curious about people, respectful of everyone she met, committed in a way that's very rare in those days, committed to racial and ethnic equality, and insistent that her children emulate that. And she's the one who told Nelson when he was 7 years old that he could be president of the United States. Now, you also have to remember, Nelson did not know. Nelson went through life with a severe, undiagnosed dyslexia. He was 50 years old before he ever heard the word, which he pronounced dyslexia. His mother told him, surround yourself with people who are smarter than you, which is where all the gurus and the advisors and everyone else came from. It's where the incredible respect he had for expertise came from. If he'd never done anything else in the 1950s, he commissioned self-commissioned the Rockefeller Brothers reports, which brought together these extraordinary blue ribbon panels of experts in a number of fields to look into the future. He was very much a futurist. He was rather critical. He was 32 years old when Franklin Roosevelt put him in charge of Latin America. And by the way, he said, you could be president one day if you were a Democrat. Harry Truman told him the same thing. He couldn't, and it's revealing, he couldn't bring himself to change his party registration. He understood himself. He said, if I was a Democrat, then I would always be trying to hold people back. And that's not me. As a Republican, I'm always trying to push people forward, which is very revealing in a lot of ways.
Does he believe what they say? Does he believe that switching parties will provide a gateway to the
presidency? He later on came to believe that he was in the wrong party. But, it was too long,
By that time, the party had changed dramatically.
But there was a problem.
Yeah.
What Nelson Rockefeller, in some ways, what makes him incredibly contemporary, I don't know about Austin, Texas contemporary, but he said he had a Republican head and a Democratic heart.
Yeah.
And meet Esposito, who's this wonderful, raffish, cigar-chomping, Runyon-esque, crooked as a day is long, but colorful as hell, Tammany-type boss from Brooklyn, became one of his unlikely collaborators. It was said that Nelson in New York owned one political party and rented the other. And I can tell you, the lease went cheap. But anyway, Meade Esposito said, And he summed it up better than anyone else. He said he was too liberal for the Republicans and too conservative for the Democrats. What he was non-ideological. He was a pragmatist who called himself a problem solver. And I would argue that there are tens of millions of Americans out there today who might not think of themselves as Rockefeller Republicans, but who in effect share those same instincts. They're tired of having everything filtered through ideological labels. Right. They're not comfortable labeling themselves. They want a government that is as competent as it is compassionate. And leaders who can learn from their mistakes. And Nelson, the problem with the term Rockefeller Republican is it meant one thing in 1962 and another thing in 1972. Mm-hmm. Because Rockefeller himself, stop and think. You just isolate those years. He was governor of New York from 1959 until 1973. Those were amazingly turbulent years.
4 terms. He got elected 4 times.
4 terms. The only governor in modern times elected 4 terms. The last term by the biggest margin ever.
Right.
So clearly people... It's one of the things that he did that I don't think anyone could do today. Certainly no one is trying to in this election. Every 4 years, he would sat out 30 points behind. Didn't matter who he was running against. He'd be 30 points behind because people were sick of him. They were sick of his taxes. They were sick of his programs. They were sick of his enthusiasm. They were sick of, they were sick of him. So in the third term, he runs for a third term in 1966. And he starts out 30 points behind anyone. Doesn't matter who it is. Half a dozen names, he's behind them by 30 points. And it very quickly came down to this. Imagine a candidate's advisors today sitting around and saying, you've got to run an educational campaign that convinces people that their taxes are being well spent. Can you imagine anyone doing that? Or any candidate taking that advice? But that's exactly what Nelson did. Go on YouTube and look at the commercials. The best campaign commercials in history because they were entertaining and they were informative and they were persuasive. There was the talking fish that said how much his life had improved since Governor Rockefeller's Pure Waters anti-pollution program.
Who doesn't love a talking fish?
$1 billion bond program to clean up the Hudson and New York Harbor. New York State spent more money fighting water pollution than the federal government did in 50 states. Give you an idea but the same is true of education and housing. There was one great commercial. For 60 seconds, all you saw was an aerial shot of highway. You're moving along at a rapid rate, and in the background is this unmistakably tinny Hawaiian luau music. What's the connection? And if at the end the voice says, Governor Rockefeller has built enough roads to get to Honolulu and back. Well, guess what? And then he went out on the road, and wherever he went, he took on people. And he said, look, this is what you're getting. If you don't want this level of government, fine, vote for the other guy. But don't believe that you can have it without paying taxes. And that is a message we don't hear very often, these days.
You can't have it both ways.
You can't have it both ways. But more than that, not only can you not have it both ways, it was an argument for the positive effects of good government. Competent, smart, future-oriented, programmatically thoughtful government. And in area after area after area, mass transit, housing, civil rights, women's rights, mandatory seat belts, reform divorce laws. You just on and on and on. The first state arts council in America. The legislators hated it. They talked about toe dancing and demonstrated a general Philistinism that one associates with legislators, particularly in New York. And Rockefeller finally said, we traded judges for ballet dancers. But once the camel got its nose under the tent, guess what? Legislators were competing to announce grants to this orchestra and this museum. But again, that's his mother. Abby founded the Museum of Modern Art. Nelson collected with a passion. His press secretary in Albany once said out loud, I don't know if the American people are ready to elect a president who collects Picasso. The legislators, he filled the executive mansion, built, occupied since Samuel J. Tilden, and some would say not refurbished in the intervening period. He filled the place with Pollock and Picasso and Motherwell and sculpture. He loved sculptures. And of course, the legislators would come and just, one of them suggested that his favorite painting be referred to the Select Committee on Pornography. They didn't know what to make of it. And then, of course, he tore down Albany, 99 acres of downtown Albany, where 3,000 people were then living, to build the mall, the South Mall, a capital commensurate with what he believed to be the majesty of the Empire State, inspired by Brasilia. In many ways, it was known as Brasilia on the Hudson. But it's there, and you can criticize it. Albany's gotten more than used to it. But what you can't deny is there are very few people then, and there's almost no one today, who had that level of imagination. It's one reason why he and Lyndon Johnson were in so many ways kindred spirits.
Talk about that, because Lyndon Johnson held Rockefeller in the highest regards, and in some ways, I think he would have chosen Nelson Rockefeller as his heir apparent.
Well, he did.
More than anyone else.
He did. The relationship went back a long ways, back to the 1930s. It's not well known. Nelson wanted to buy a ranch in South Texas. He had 5 other homes, and so why not add a ranch? He eventually settled for a ranch in Venezuela, bigger than Manhattan. But he couldn't get, he would come down every year to the King Ranch and met the Klebergs, and of course met Congressman Kleberg and his hyperkinetic administrative assistant, and they seemed to have taken an instant shine to one another. I think they, however different their backgrounds, they recognized they had many of the same aspirations for the future and many of the same instincts.
Let me interject that Kleberg's hyperkinetic assistant is Lyndon Johnson, a very young Lyndon Johnson, circa 1934 to 1937. I apologize.
Yeah, no. And then I found a letter, really touching letter. LBJ had just come to the Senate. There was a famous incident in which a young Mexican Army veteran, I believe, had been killed, and the local community, frankly, refused to bury him of sheer rank prejudice. And Johnson, this is long before he was a national figure, secured a burial slot at Arlington National Cemetery. And Nelson, who had spent World War II and thereafter falling in love with Latin America, wrote to congratulate Johnson on what he had done, and the response was very revealing. It was very clear that there's some real respect and appreciation, instinctive appreciation. Later on, of course, Johnson was master of the Senate, and Sam Rayburn. There's a wonderful story. In 1959, Nelson went on a speaking tour all over the country to see if he should run against Vice President Nixon in 1960. And he came to Dallas. And the only friend he had there was Sam Rayburn, who drove a couple hours to be there. He said just to show Nelson he had some friends in Texas. But the room full of Republicans was not particularly friendly then or ever, frankly. But one wonderful Mr. Rayburn story. Dwight Eisenhower had created a National Commission on Outdoor Recreation and asked Lawrence Rockefeller, who Lady Bird Johnson always referred to as Mr. Conservation. The wonderful story of Bess Abel, who many of you know, told me LBJ used to say, "Where's Lady Bird? Is she out planting tulip bulbs with Lawrence Rockefeller again?" So Nelson wasn't the only Rockefeller who was close to the Johnsons. But anyway, so Lawrence Rockefeller agreed to be chairman of this commission. But Congress, for whatever reason, provided no funding. Now, Sam Rayburn's friends were raising money to build a Sam Rayburn library, and they were a couple $100,000 short of their goal. And Nelson went to the Rockefeller Foundation and said why this was a good idea, and so they took care of the $200,000. Well, then came this incident with Lawrence. Speaker Rayburn said, "I'll take care of it." He climbed down from the podium, which was a very rare occurrence, and from the floor of the House made a pitch for funding for this commission. And let's say the debt was canceled. But it's no doubt the Speaker and then Senator Johnson felt a real affinity for Nelson as an activist. Mm-hmm. And I suspect, like FDR and Truman, they thought he was in the wrong party. Right. As soon as LBJ becomes president, even though Nelson's running against him in 1964, it never seems to have gotten personal. In fact, a wonderful story, he supported President Johnson on Vietnam. I think there was a little bit of a friendly competition because while LBJ was pursuing the Great Society nationally, Nelson in New York was pursuing his own Great Society. Mm-hmm. And he had the help of a Democratic legislature. Because of the Johnson landslide in '64, the Democrats took the legislature for the first time since the 1930s. And the irony is it's the best legislature Rockefeller ever had. It passed Medicaid, among other things. Now, Medicaid is the backbone, in some ways, the apogee of the liberal drive in 20th century America. And it does illustrate Nelson's tendency to let enthusiasms get away with him. He bought the program right away. He made the program his own. He embraced it enthusiastically. And only then did he discover that it was in danger of bankrupting the state. And it turned out, God's honest truth, Jacob Javits said, "Nelson, at the rate you're spending, you're going to spend every dollar the federal government has set aside for Medicaid." Well, in fact, he spent more than every dollar the federal government had set aside for Medicaid. In 1968, I've talked to Mr. Temple, who was the man who smuggled Nelson Rockefeller in and out of the White House in April of 1968. Remember, in March, Rockefeller said, "I'm not running." 10 days later, President Johnson withdrew from the race. 4 days later, Dr. King was killed. 2 weeks after that, Rockefeller was in Washington. He and Happy are brought to President Johnson in the White House for dinner and conversation. And it was very clear what President Johnson wanted was for Nelson to change his mind and get back into the race. And Nelson said at one point, "Mr. President, I'm not the one you have to convince. It's her." Well, Happy Rockefeller described Lyndon Johnson to me as a magnificent animal. And she meant it as a compliment. She and Lyndon Johnson hit it off. During the famous blackout in New York in November of 1967, there's a telephone call made by President Johnson to the White House. The Rockefellers lived on the 12th and 13th floors of this apartment building, and they had trudged up through the dark to their home. and the call came through, and it's pure Johnson. It's just wonderful. He's calling to see if he can help. Is there anything Washington can do, et cetera, et cetera. And then, of course, it becomes more personal. And he said, we got to get those lights on. Nelson, I don't care about seeing you in the light, but I want to see Happy. And there was just this kind of very good-natured, instinctive family feeling. Nelson did get into the race. Too late. Richard Nixon wins the nomination. Then, the sequel. After the Republican convention, but before the Democratic convention, Hubert Humphrey's emissaries call Nelson in Maine and ask him if he would run for vice president with Humphrey, if he would join a coalition government, a government of national unity, which, if you remember the times, would have had great appeal. And eventually Humphrey himself called